I think, 5 presentations to go through, and the sequence, just the way it is given in the list already provided. So I'll follow that list in inviting the presenters to deliver their presentation. So is that fine, Samavia?
Sure, sir.
All right. So our first presenter is Amna Salim Mutalla from University of Karachi, and her topic is enmeshed in politics. Uh, how Pakistani post-colonial Anglophone literature emerged from national politics. So I would like to invite Amna Mutalla to take over and take us through the presentation. Amna, are you with us?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So over to you then.
Sure, sir.
If you're using any slides, so I think the coordinator can help you display the slides.
Yes, I'm just. Right. Is this viewable for you guys? Can you view this?
Yes, it's viewable.
Okay. Okay, so my name is Amna Mutalla. I'm from the University of Karachi. I'm an MPhil scholar there at the Department of English. So I'll just get right on with the topic at hand. So the paper I have here, it concerned itself with the idea of national literatures responding to national politics. So at the beginning of this project, when I was writing this paper, I was actually curious to see of how Pakistani Anglophone literature came into being and how it developed. And I had this inkling that national politics may have had a role to play in what kind of themes these texts encompassed, because again, Pakistan has had such a diverse political environment. It's been so dynamic. I had this inkling that there must have been some connection, that these writers must have witnessed these political eras and responded to it in some way or the other. So that was the purpose of the study, to see if there is any relationship between that early literature of Pakistan with its national politics. So I have here 3 texts that I analyzed in the study. It was for the limit of my study, I kept the dates from 1940 till the late 80s. That was the period I looked at. So the first thing that I noticed was that the early first generation writers that we have were actually responding to national politics, and not just national politics of Pakistan itself, but rather the specific eras that they were writing in. So the first text I used was Ahmad Ali's Twilight in Delhi. Now, this was actually written before Pakistan came into being. It was written in 1940. And it can be argued that Pakistan hadn't even come into being then, so how do you include it in the Pakistani fiction canon, right? But many critics, including Tariq Rahman, Muniza Shamsi, and David Anderson, all believe that Twilight in Delhi is a seminal text that needs to be included in the Pakistani Anglophone literary canon, fiction canon specifically, because so many people, when they found their new nationality as Pakistanis, now these were people who had migrated from the subcontinent. So what the material that they found in Ali's novel was something that they resonated with. And so to speak, they turned to that novel. And Tariq Rahman says that there was a dearth of good literature in the country. So naturally, it came to be that this novel became part of the Pakistani Anglophone fiction literary tradition. So when I looked at this novel, on the surface level, this novel is an elegy. It's a lamentation about a time that has passed, a culture that has deteriorated. But that's the surface level of it. What I discovered when I was looking into this text, when I was analyzing it using a close reading approach, what I discovered is that the nostalgia present in this novel was actually a narrative framework that Ali had used in order to critique the present that he was witnessing in this 1940s wala era, right? So he looked at the British Empire, and this was a time of high political tensions, because it was on the verge of breaking apart. The subcontinent had the two-nation theory had already been instilled in many minds. And so what Ali did beneath that nostalgic framework was that he presented a desire to critique the colonial powers that were present in the subcontinent. So this is why in the novel, some of the most heart-wrenching scenes are the ones that critique the British Empire directly through the words of Mir Nihal. For instance, the scene where you see the mutiny of 1857 or the massacre at Jama Masjid. And those were actually the scenes that were that editors were calling to be removed from the text because they were too political, too gory to be placed. And this novel faced a lot of problems in its publication. And I think that was largely because it was so political. It was so subversively political, even though on the surface level, it's just a novel that romanticizes and idealizes the culture of Delhi in the subcontinent. The second text that I had was The Murder of Aziz Khan in 1967. Now, whereas Ali's text was political beneath the surface, Zulfikar goes all out, and his novel is political right from the start. It's straightforwardly political. And what you have is the figure of Aziz Khan becomes a symbol for you, and a symbol that symbolizes all of the victimization that the lower classes were facing when Pakistan was on a turning end in the 1960s. So in the 1960s, you had textile industries that were cropping up. So Pakistan was experiencing the rise of capitalism. But with that rise of industrialization and capitalism, you had a rise of corruption and exploitation. So what happened was in the 1960s, there were many Marxist forces that were at work, which were responding to and complaining about this kind of exploitation. And what Ghose's novel does is that it becomes a part of those reactionary forces that were against these texts, against these forces, right? So what you have is Aziz Khan, and he represents that victimization. And in this novel, you find many themes like the rise of industrialization, you find the widening social gap, and the ill treatment of socialists and laborers, and rising corruption, and all of these themes. You find bribery, you find just a very plain reality presented to you, a very plain political reality. And as Ghose's novel, again, was also, it was published quite fairly easily, but it was heavily critiqued after its publication. The next novel that I undertook was Ice Candy Man by Bubsy Silva. This is the 1980s. Now, what Silva does is she's a pioneering writer as well. In the Pakistani canon, she's always included. What she presents is a different kind of politics in her novel. She presents a social, feminist, and minority politics in her novel. And as a female writer, what she does is she lends her voice to the marginalized female communities of Pakistan, which is why you see that the novel is dominated by Hindu and Parsi female figures such as Aya and Lenny and Mother and Godmother. All of these figures just dominate the scene. And I think that was Sidwa's purpose here, to represent them on the ground, on the voices that they were not getting in Pakistan. Or while the setting that she uses is a fictional setting of the pre-partition era, but I think the reality of this novel lies in the kind of representation that she provides for these marginalized communities. So late 70s Pakistan and early 80s Pakistan was the time when feminist forces were on the rise. You had, so these feminists were critiquing the state-sanctioned oppression of women. In many ways, they were critiquing the Islamization of women in Pakistan. And you also had the emergence of the Women's Action Forum, right? And what they were doing is that they were rising up against these state forces at work against women. So what you had was an era that was highly charged with feminist politics, and I think this novel represents that era perfectly, that she presents a social and feminist critique of that era. So I'll just sum up. So what I found when I was looking at these texts, now for the limit of my study, I could not expand this, but I tried to pick up as many pioneering and first generation writers, and these are writers that are considered mainstream. So I thought that their works would be considered representative in the canon. So what I found was that there are definitely links that you can find between these texts and the kind of national politics that was at work during that time. And literature doesn't exist in a vacuum, as we know. There is always historical and social context that people respond to. And I think we can always look back at these texts as cultural products. We can look back at them as products that refer to and represent the eras that Pakistan was experiencing when it started off and had such a diverse political environment. What I did find was that all three of these writers, many of these, in fact, first generation writers, use the realist technique of fiction writing. And as far as I can analyze, is that this realist technique of fiction writing aided these writers because they wanted to represent political realities in their work, and I think that was for the most part achieved fairly well. That is it on my end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmad, for this very interesting talk about the political and social context in which literature is produced and how the Pakistani Anglophone writers were influenced in their writing by the political context. Okay, so next we have another very interesting topic, and but the more interesting part is that we will be now dealing with poetry and okay, so maybe yeah, it's the fan which is interfering. So the title of the presenter, the next two presenters or the next presenter is Namra Yusuf from Coherent College for Women, for Women University Lahore, and the topic of the talk is the marginalized medium facing language appropriation and deprivation in Shadab Hashmi's poems. Okay, so Nibra and Kirat Malik from the Coherent College for Women University. So they have joined us. So please take over and take us through the presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Namra Yusuf. I'm a co-presenter Kirat Malik, and the paper that we're presenting today is The Marginalized Idiom, Tracing Language Appropriation and Deprivation in Shadab Hashmi's Poems. As we begin, Kirat, can you please present the slides? As we begin and dive into our topic, I'd first like to quote Zerbe Kalim, where Iqbal questions and negates the fundamental reliance on West for civilization and culture. Zinda kar sakti hai Iran o Arab ko kyun kar? Ye firangi madaniyat ke jo khud hai labe gaur. The blanketed and pervasive effects of colonialism reign and pattern the pragmatics of Pakistani literature through systematic cycle of deprivation. This research attempts to explore the avenues of subjective linguistic deprivation as a result of colonial hegemony. The direct colonial influence that Iqbal resists to counter blends into the post-colonial narrative, whereby subjective dispossession blends into the language and its contents. Language carries a culture within itself, and adopting a language brings in a culture as well. To counter the colonial hegemony over language, Tawfiq Rafat proposes the term Pakistani idiom that recognizes and invigorates self-identity within the master's language through domesticated imagery, culture, and language. However, the initial reliance of invigorating the Pakistani idiom on stylistics and imagery renders it as a marginalized idiom unable to cater to the memories and rhetoric of domestic writers. As Makki Qureshi, an early post-colonial poet from Pakistan, points her dilemma in her poem Kittens, snagged by the two cultures, which shall I choose? As a result, Pakistani writers are immersed in a continuous cycle of invigorating and empowering their domesticated idiom. Now, in contemporary literature, Shadab Hashmi is a Pakistani-American poet who maneuvers on the pragmatics of nostalgia, selfhood, and self-identity. This research attempts to explore the contemporary avenues of reclaiming and tracing the invigorating of Pakistani idiom through the role of language appropriation. Now, this research aims to navigate the role of language appropriation in curating the Pakistani idiom as a self-expression and resistance against colonial subjugation. Now, the primary texts that we've chosen for this research are Hashmi's poems Bilingual and Passing Through Peshawar. Now, moving towards the literature review, Lloyd, in What is Minority Discourse and What's to be Done, contends that minority intellectuals still communicate in European languages in professional capacities because rather than their own, because of the inherent deprivation and the otherization that is inculcated in them that makes them realize and feel that their own local dialect is inferior to that of the imperial one. Alamgir Hashmi further sketches the existence of new cultural and personal identities in post-colonial discourses that attempt to merge with the host culture for shared experiences. Similarly, Kahinde's analysis proposes that the art of domesticating the language is a viable tradition to reclaim the forlorn identity. However, Kahinde's analysis mainly stresses upon language appropriation as a stylistic and thematic technique in order to retain the cultural authenticity of the colonized subject, and it does not focus on the depriving effects that invigorate and enmesh the subjects to retain it. As a result, it overlooks psychological impulses. Consequently, while there has been abundant research upon the stylistic techniques of language appropriation, it is observed that the major proportion of the work concentrates upon stylistic and thematic technicalities, thereby overlooking the underlying psychology and its depriving effect on the poet and the collective conscience. Now, this study aims to fill this gap and aims to dig deeper into the effect of language appropriation and highlights the empowerment that linguistic idiom sustains through this medium. Now, the research questions that are entailed in this paper include: in what ways has the master's language become a tool of cultural richness and linguistic uphold in a post-colonial era? And can the language appropriation fully cater to the deprived collective conscience of a South Asian poet? Now, Kirat will take over for further dissection and analysis of the poems.
Okay, so am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So while analyzing poems, you see that Hashmi is passing through Peshawar. It actually lingers on echoes of nationhood, identity, and a very nostalgic representation through a very systematic inculcation of the domestic language, i.e., the Urdu language. And we see that it provides some sort of an empowerment accompanied with a sense of resistance as well, as she includes the words of Tonga horses. Now, the inculcation of the word of Tonga into an English poem, it actually stands as an amalgamation of Urdu and Hindi dialect into the English language. We see that when we trace the etymology of the word Tonga, we see that it traces itself back to the Hindi dialect, where it has been predominantly and constantly been used in South Asian dialects like the Urdu and Hindi language. Now, this sense of loss, the subjugation, the deprivation, it comes out of the events of partition back in 1947, and we see that all of this loss and subjugation, it has actually costed a psychological impact on the Pakistani people and the writers, so much so that they that it continuously navigates the writers like Hashmi to appropriate their language in the dialect of the imperialists. Now, in passing to Peshawar, Hashmi constantly curates a nostalgic yet empowering representation of identity and language through language appropriation. Like, she reminisces the hums of tandoors and the filmy songs in order to provide certain thematic and linguistic empowerment to her own marginalized idiom. Now, while moving on from Hashmi's passing through Peshawar to bilingual, we see that in bilingual, Hashmi traces the marginalized idiom that reflects the language deprivation of the otherized identity. Now, in the very opening stanza of bilingual, Hashmi sketches an imagery of a butcher's shop where there are several tongues marinated into some sort of auspicious herbs and stuff, and we see that every language it has its own culture, its own common sense embedded into it. Now, the marinated tongues, moving back to the marinated tongues, we see that the marinated tongues are actually a representation of the Urdu and the English languages. And the Pakistani people, if we talk about ourselves, we have been dually influenced by Urdu and English language, by Eastern and Western cultures, which has actually resulted in the creation of a hybrid identity and a hybrid culture as well. I feel like when we talk about hybrid identity and a creation of a hybrid culture, we see that this is why Pakistani idiom itself seems to be under a constant confluence of becoming the marginalized idiom itself. Now, in relation with this, we see that Hashmi says, and I quote, that if I may have to, give me that other one, that many-textured one, that crisp and high and sublime. Now, the contrasting imageries of the tongues, of the tongues, we see that they represent the power cue and the power dynamics in between the language of the East and language of the West as well. We see that they stand as a metaphor for the dominant idiom and the marginalized idiom. Now, talking about the invasion of English language, we see that this invasion of the English language has caused a systematic death of the language, the culture, the identity, and common sense of the natives, of the Eastern people, of the Pakistani people in particular. We see that, but this appropriation of language by the writers, it has some sort of the appropriation of the domestic language within the imperialized language has provide some sort of resistance and empowerment and thematic and linguistic empowerment to writers and our native speakers as well. Now, apart from this, we also see that Rohashni presents a blend of intercultural references in the poems. Like while describing the two different tongues, she uses the words of the mesc sash and a bit of a peach and words like tapioca. And when we trace the origins of these words, we see that the mesc and tapioca are originated in the West, whereas peaches, they are an Eastern specialty. Now, this very deliberate inculcation of imagery, ecology, and language itself, it sort of indicates the amalgamation of East and West, namely the Urdu and the English language. And we see that this is not only linguistic but also cultural in nature, also thematic in nature. Now, talking about the realm of empowerment, we see that this constant and deliberate appropriation of domestic language within the imperialized idiom, it has created some sort of a realm of empowerment while maintaining a form of resistance as well. Like we are resorting to a language, but also resisting to resort to a language by incorporating our own words into it. Now, Hashmi also reminisces some sort of a forceful and authoritative annexation of language, as she quotes the word "filled my mouth." Like the implication of the word "filled" itself, indicates a forceful action. Now, when we talk about ourselves in the present context, we have been forcefully subjected to a Western language, and the result of that is a very unconscious hybridity of language as well, of language and of identity, which seems to be hindering the operative role of enmeshed language and culture. Now, the very linguistic deprivation that we've been talking about, we see that it arises out of the imperialization of language, the inability to express in the dialect of the Western people or in the dialect of the dominant people. We feel like we have been marginalized because of that. Now, this unwilling dependency on the dialect, on the dominant dialect or the imperialist dialect, we see that it is a constant division, a conscious division, which has multiple layers, not just linguistic, not just psychological, but it has multiple layers as well. Now in contrast with that, we see that the language appropriation, the incorporation of domestic language within the language of the imperializer, we see that we have been provided a sense of a certain empowerment and resistance. Now, through the analysis of both the poems, bilingual and passing through Peshawar, we see that the dissection of psychological and literary paradigms therefore reveals the effectiveness of language appropriation, which acts as a bridge between the cultural and linguistic empowerment. So conclusively, this research will aim to aid in predicting the patterns of contemporary literary criticism in the South Asian context, and the marginalized idiom is being continuously navigated with the help of language appropriation, and it's a continuous cycle in which we locate the deprivation and we try to counter it with the help of language appropriation or simply with the help of domestic inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nabra and Kirat, for this very interesting presentation about the relation between language, identity, and empowerment through language, through through linguistic strategies and techniques. Okay, so next we have Ms. Tahreem Orakzai from Coherent College and Dr. Amir Aziz from Institute of English Studies, University of Punjab, and their topic is an extrapolative national and transnational exploration of the rhizomatic borderland consciousness and transversal power in the Hamidesque geopolitical fiction and non-fiction. So quite a title. Let's see what you say.
I am finding it difficult to upload the slides, so if the coordinator could kindly help me with this.
Sure.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. So I am really grateful to all of you for attending the session. Good afternoon to all of you. And I do agree it's a loaded title. And I'd like to, talk about, I'll walk you through this really convoluted web of borders and borderlands as best as I can. So the title of my presentation is An Extrapolative National and Transnational Exploration of the Rhizomatic Borderland Consciousness and Transversal Power in the Ahmadist Geopolitical Fiction and Nonfiction. So this research basically intends to foreground the possibilities and power storytelling offers in a world which is rife with identity politics and local politics of inclusion and exclusion. In order to imagine a world of flexible borders, the research delves into the Ahmadist fictional space, which presents a poetics of resistance to tribalism and bordered communities of natives and non-natives. The focal purpose of this article is to view as what Elif Shafak terms as an existential. I hope the screen is visible to everyone.
Yes, the screen is visible.
Okay, thank you. So the focal purpose of this article is to view fiction as what Elif Shafak terms as an existential glue in her TED Talk, The Politics of Fiction. Shafak believes that fiction connects humanity across time and space, whereas politics divides. In this article, I've tried to demonstrate the symbiotic coalescence and divergence of storyland and homeland, and attempted to unlayer isms like nationalism, transnationalism through subversive magical realism. Gloria Anzaldua's borderlands theory, Deleuze's concept of rhizome, and the notion of transversal power have been incorporated. In the postmodern world, writers of border, minority, third world literature take upon themselves the task of reimagining a world where the writer and reader are global citizens of the world, transcending boundaries of first and third world. There is a fourth world, which is post-normal, post-magical realism, a world which envisions existential and diasporic angst through a world seemingly connected by technology. This article predominantly focuses on Hamid's Reluctant Fundamentalist and Exit West as texts that show a convergence and divergence of the East and West, the magical and real worlds. To decode Hamid the writer and the man, the article also relies on his non-fictional essays from his book Discontent and Its Civilizations, Dispatches from Lahore, New York, and London. To gain an in-depth insight into the Hamidist fictional space, the article touches upon moth smoke and how to get filthy rich in rising Asia to get a sense of the Pakistani dream and a global model of writing. By global, I mean global and local. Model of writing which then extends to the immigrant's dream. So basically, the motive here is to talk about the power of storytelling, how literature, especially border literature, can yoke the center and the margin, or at least initiate a conversation about empathy, where one can understand the cost of crossing borders. Here we need to acknowledge the fact that technology and travel, these are two luxuries that not everyone can afford. But the ones who do, they become, people who cross borders, they also become different entities, rather alien entities, for their own people as well as for the places that they immigrate to. So stories move like whirling Deveshas, drawing circles beyond circles. They connect all humanity regardless of identity politics, and that is the good news. Here we are trying to see writers as visionary architects, building global fictional cartographies. Where politics falls short of bridging this gap, literature comes to the rescue to join the natives and the non-natives through a shared sense of beingness, as Mohsin Hamid says in Exit West. So just a brief overview, this presentation aims to decode the protean quality of modern fictional borders that seemingly transcend the politics of inclusion and exclusion. In Mohsin Hamid's political fictional scape, border literature is reformative and cathartic. It transcends national politics, and it tries to sensitize the readers by foregrounding human tragedy. It tries to eradicate emotional anemia. There are different kinds of borders. They can be technological borders, they can be political borders. And in Exit West, we have these black magical doors which serve as as thresholds, as exit and entry points for people to immigrate to. So moving on. Now, the predominant research concerns that I want to address here are the fundamental question that I want to pose here is basically with reference to the crevice between natives and non-natives. Can there be a symbiosis of native and non-native binaries? Is there still hope for the world at large? Can we eradicate political divisiveness through the power of mind? As by transversal power, I mean to talk about the power of mind, the mindscape. Can the mindscape help us in tackling the landscape, which is divided by identity politics, racial profiling? And this is something that we witness in The Reluctant Fundamentalist, Exit West, where despite globalization, despite technological progress, there are still borders and boundaries that need to be crossed. So there is this illusion of elusive connectivity, and yet there are certain political walls that can be seen in the background. And here, again, I would like to reiterate that, quoting from Exit West, tales were told at these places that people from all over now gathered to hear. For the tales of these natives felt appropriate to this time of migration and gave listeners much needed sustenance. So as Ellis Shafak says, literature serves as an existential balm, as an existential adhesive that connects people across spaces, color, and caste. Can fiction or the power of mind, or as this paper refers to, Deleuze's transversal power? Now, this is good. Deleuze and Guattari are French post-structuralist geophilosophers, and Guattari is he is a psychoanalyst who basically came up with this notion of transversal power, and it basically posits that transversality redirects the subject's unconscious from his or her fixation with the past, so that he or she can first realize that their desires are always already to be found in a group fantasy. Following the realization, the individual is free to embody desires directed towards future forms of belonging and becoming. Now, transversal power is a form of you can say a horizontal power, a power that comes from within, that provokes the migrants to think about themselves thinking. It is an uncontrolled power that one has to foster on one's own. Moving on, as far as the theoretical framework is concerned, I'm talking about Gloria E. Anzaldua's borderlands theory. Anzaldua herself was a migrant, and she also talks about linguistic terrorism. So there are linguistic borders as well that one can look into. And like Manto and Mohsin Anzaldua is also a migrant and a victim of rigid political borders. Now, the concept of borderlands. Borderlands are improvisational spaces. They are formed when the third world grates against the first, and as a result, a border culture is formed. And this third country, or if you can also relate this to Bhabha's notion of the third space, an alternative space where such individuals can reside. A sense of in-betweenness with reference to language, identity, race, gender. Anzaldua's notion of a third country, okay, I've mentioned this. Moving on, transversal power and rhizomatic borderland consciousness. Now, this is the loaded part. There was this theater professor, Brian Reynolds, who came to Punjab University, and his talk was titled Performance Activism, Transversal Potentialities. And there he talked about a network of resistance to counter violence prevalent in war-torn conflict zones. And Reynolds, it was then that I got to know about transversal power, and I started, looking it up. And then I found out that Guattari also talks about this power, and this is with reference to war zones, particularly, like Palestine. As per the Norton anthology reader, unlike the tree, the rhizome is not the object of reproduction, neither external reproduction as image, tree, nor internal reproduction. It is anti-genealogy. A rhizome is basically a non-signifying, a non-hierarchical, horizontal system of power that enables the border crossers to deal with the dilemma of displacement and linguistic terrorism. Moving on, borderland consciousness. It is important to note that Anzaldua's borderland emerges from the US-Mexican border, but it's not just confined to that. It can be applied to other borders as well, Pakistan-India border, or Pakistan. And over here, we are talking about the American dream of a Pakistani immigrant. So it can be applied to different contexts as well. The borderland consciousness is thus a liminal mode of thinking, adapting in living ways in pursuit of spaces of peaceful coexistence and acceptance. If you notice, as far as Hamid's fictional space is concerned, it talks about academic spaces. Now, academic spaces are civilized spaces. And they actually, it also shows you that he's not pandering to a Western audience. He is presenting a very balanced picture of an educated individual who, when crosses the border, he cannot grapple with the fact that, he thinks that there is a sense of equilibrium. People can coexist. There has to be a sense of empathy, but that is not shown to Changiz. He's constantly professing the fact that he is a lover of America, and if you notice, stylistically speaking, the narrative is in the form of a dramatic monologue and not a dialogue. The film was later changed into a dialogue, but yet the question remains that borders are there. There are still divisions that need to be addressed. Okay, moving on. Now I'd like to leave you with a quote, which is with reference to the geopolitical fiction and non-fiction that Hamid writes. Modern man is a nomad, a technological, geographical nomad. Hamid aptly presents his notion of migrants through time and exit west. And you don't need to necessarily cross spaces. You can be in the same place, but that same place also changes with a passage of time. So that's all I have to say. These were loaded concepts, and I couldn't, just sum them up in 10 minutes. So I hope if you have any questions, I'll address them after the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Wonderful talk. Quite, interesting, despite being, rather heavy with these philosophical concepts. So the interesting part was this idea of the fourth world and this older literature that you talked about. So we'll inshallah talk about it as you said after the presentations are done. So let's move to our next participant, and we have I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but is it Amish Hassan Askari from Bahria University, Islamabad, and the topic is the intersection of history, memory, and post-memory in Basti, a novel by Intizar Hussain. Ji, please take over.
Okay, thank you. Hello. Can you hear me? Hello. Can everyone hear me? Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, fine. Let me just. I'm actually new to this Google Meet mode. I'm sorry if I'm taking time. Can someone please guide me on how to share the slides here?
You can use the share screen option that is given at the below in the bar.
Okay.
With the arrow option to represent your slides.
Your entire screen. Okay, fine. I'm sorry if I'm taking time. So Okay, fine. I found it. Fine. Okay. So thank you very much, the organizers of this conference on emerging trends in arts, humanities, and social sciences. Uh, I shall try to be as brief as possible. There are quite two to three things that I'm concerned about in my paper. So first, how the basic question that we shall address is about the relationship between history and fiction. So a novel by Intezar Hussain Saab Basti is the novel which from where we would draw our relationship between history and memory. So let me just quickly take you through the introduction to the novel, what this novel basically says, and what's the narrative in this novel. So बस्ती was published in 1979. इंतजार हुसैन साहब का novel है और and in 1971 Pakistan had been through a trauma. It was Pakistan was divided. The East Pakistan got separated from Pakistan. So the novel must be seen in that backdrop. So the protagonist of the novel is a young professor of history whose name is Zakir, who has migrated to this new country, obviously in 1947, but from an idyllic town in Uttar Pradesh, which is referred to in the novel as Roopnagar. So Zakir is a professor of history, and just because he's a professor of history and he's a melancholic character, he keeps living in the past memories, the memories of the War of Independence told by his father, and the memories of 1947, and then the migration, and then the memories of the 1971 and the war of secession war that ultimately led to the breakup of Pakistan. So all these although he's witness to the last two events, that is the partition of India and the partition of Pakistan in 1971, yet he remains all the time, he remains in those memories, and the novel keeps switching back into his memories and to the present. So memory of one catastrophic event leads to the other, and then the memory takes him back to the early history of Islam, and then to the stories of creation of the universe. And these stories are always told to him by his grandmother or his father. So that is basically the idea. So to sum up, the basic idea of the novel is that the novel was written in the backdrop of 1971 war and the separation of East Pakistan, and then the protagonist of the novel is basically a character. He's a professor of history who is himself is a migrant who is migrated from probably although Intezar Hussain Saab does not necessarily tell you from where he has migrated, but from the setting and the surroundings, you can always see that he probably has migrated from Uttar Pradesh, UP, where you see a complex of Indo-Muslim culture visible. I'll talk about that Indo-Muslim cultural complex later on, but for now, we need to understand what the novel basically is and what the narrative is. So a lot of it has a lot of the literary critics have written about the technique of the novel. So the novel continuously switches from a third-person omniscient narrator to the first-person narrative, and this transition is hardly noticeable. So, for instance, at one moment you are reading about the memories of Zakir in a small town in UP, and then suddenly the scene shifts into some part of Lahore where Zakir is presently situated. So the reader has to struggle to understand where is the event taking place, and the way Intezar Hussain Saab writes about those events does not necessarily tell you as to which part of history is he referring to. So he rather takes a very collective and humanistic approach to history. So for instance, Zakir is reminded of the events of War of Independence, although he has not lived through War of Independence of 1857, but he is reminded of all those memories as told by his father and grandmother. So his grandmother is somebody who has lived through the times of War of Independence. So this obviously relates to a concept known as post-memory, to which I shall refer subsequently. So all these events are recalled in flashbacks, the events of 1857, mainly the rupture of 1947, and then the rupture of 1971. So the reader recognizes all these events not by their known historical attributes, but by the effect they have on Zakir. So for instance, all those events that I have spoken about, the events of 1856, 1857, War of Independence, the events of 1947 and then 1971. Although there is not much literature available on 1971, neither in history nor in literature, but still the reader is able to understand as to which event they are referring to. So for instance, 1857 War of Independence and 1947, reader can always understand or make sense as to which event is he referring to. So from those traumatic events, Zakir's memory shifts back to the stories of creation, of how this world was created, as told by his grandmother and his father. So from this, the scene shifts into the stories of Hindu mythology. Now, Hindu mythology is something that is very close to Intezar Hussain Saab's heart. He is always referred to, and he's somebody who is known to mix the mythology with the realism and stream of conscious techniques, which are popular modern literary techniques. So that was a bit about the technique of the novel. Now, earlier on, I also spoke about the post memory. So where does this concept of post memory come from, and how is this post memory, the concept of post memory, relevant to the protagonist that we are talking about, namely Zakir? So post memory, I borrowed this concept from Marian Hirsch. Post memory, to put it very simply, is the memory which not necessarily individual has lived, but it is a collection of memories which relates to the traumatic events told by someone else. So for instance, when Zakir reminisces about the War of Independence in 1857, he's not somebody who has lived through all those events, but the stories of those events, as told by his father and grandmother, have such an melancholic effect on Zakir that he seems to have lived as if to reader as if Zakir has lived through the memories of 1857. So post memory simply is the memory that an individual not necessarily an individual has experienced, but it is a memory that has been transmitted to an individual from someone else's narrative, probably somebody who is from a generation earlier. The strong effects of trauma on individuals' memory, especially of those trauma felt by the preceding generations. So that basically is the post memory. So the next step, the next concept that I borrowed is the concept of cultural amnesia, as propounded by Randolph Stahn and Natalie Davis. Now, the cultural amnesia is pretty much relevant to the events of although about the events of 1947 we have failed to take a dispassionate view of the events of 1947, but still a lot is written about on the effects of 1947. You see, the writers of the progressive movement made partition as a central point of their stories. For instance, we can talk about Manto, who was deeply touched by the events of 1947, and the partition of 1947 makes a very important part of his stories. The same can be said about Krishan Chandra in his famous story Peshawar Express, and so on and so forth. But there is a complete silence on the events of 1971. And मेरे ख्याल से हम हाथों की उंगलियों पे गिन सकते हैं वो novel या वो stories या वो कहानियां या even poetry which specifically deals with the events of 1971, and there is complete silence. Now this silence tells us something about the culture of power in Pakistan. So but this novel particularly, Basti, has very important references to the events of 1971, so to which I shall refer later on. So the two concepts are interrelated. First is the post memory as propounded by Marian Hirsch, and the other one is cultural amnesia. So while there is so much literature available on 1947, there is hardly literature available on 1971, and this obviously tells us about the culture of amnesia, the weakness of our memories. इसकी सबसे बड़ी मिसाल तो ये है कि उर्दू में नासिर काज़मी के चंद एक शेर आपको मिलते हैं इस हादसे के साने के ऊपर, और इसके अलावा नसीर तुराबी की एक मशहूर नज़्म है जिसको डिफरेंट कॉन्टेक्स्ट में इस्तेमाल किया गया था एक टीवी चैनल ने एक ड्रामे के लिए, वो हम सफ़र था मगर उससे हम नवाई न थी, बट दिस पोम वाज एक्चुअली रिटन इन द कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ द सेपरेशन ऑफ ईस्ट पाकिस्तान. Besides that, there is not much literature available. There is another ghazal by Faiz Saab, हम के ठहरे अजनबी इतनी मुलाकातों के बाद. Obviously that refers to the separation of East Pakistan, but besides that, in fiction there is not much reference to the events of 1971, and that obviously tells us about the culture of amnesia that is prevalent, that has always prevailed about the events in the country. So the difference between how events occur in individuals' memory of individual, obviously Zakir, and how they appear in nationalist historiography, there is obviously a complete, as we read through the novel, there is obviously a complete disconnect between how all these events, the events of 1947, the events of 1971, take place in the realm of politics, and how those events are, then appear in nationalist historiography. And then this is something that helps us make interesting connections between the relationship between history and fiction. So I'll just try to be brief and I'll skip that up quickly. So the real question then is, how does Bubsy sees history and politics? Bubsy किस तरह से तारीख और सियासत के बारे में कुछ हमें बताती है. So पहली बात तो यह, the Bubsy marks a departure from literature on events of 1947 and 1971. Obviously 1947 के ऊपर अगर हम देखें तो there is lot of literature available, and most of the literature written from a nationalist point of view always sees partition of India as a huge event, and one that was loaded with new possibilities. So Intezar Hussain Saab makes a complete breakaway from this. He sees the event of 1947 not from some nationalistic point of view, but from a very humanistic point of view, and that humanistic point of view ultimately is brought home by Zakir. Now, Zakir has a more contemplative attitude about what takes place outside. So in the outside world, in the realm of politics, there is a division taking place, and a war of secession is imminent. But the more the turmoil increases outside, the more Zakir sinks into himself. And this is a quote I've borrowed from the novel. The more turmoil increases outside, the more I sink into myself. So what does this novel tell us about the relationship between history and fiction? So Bubsy takes an altogether new approach to popular history, one that takes interior view of the past, a feature only possible through fiction. So the argument that I'm trying to make is that Bubsy marks a complete breakaway from what was written in literature about the events of 1947, and whatever was written, although it was very small in number, whatever was written on 1971. So for instance, how is Bubsy then different from all the literature? So it is different in the sense that Intezar Hussain Saab does not fix blame on any single entity. He does not resort to the gory images of violence, which is quite a popular theme with the progressive writers and obviously with Manto. What he does basically is that he takes an individual's mind and shows how melancholic and nostalgic he has become about the past. So that ultimately tells us about a complex culture of Indo-Muslim which was prevalent at least in UP. So Zakir, when reminisces about the shared events of the past, he's basically also reminiscing at the same time about the shared cosmology between the Hindus and the Muslims. Obviously, the stories that he was told from his early childhood about the creation of the universe had a mix of Muslims and Hindu mythology. So for instance, while his father tells him about Hazrat Allah, he also at the same time as a child goes to a yogi in his village who tells him about how this universe is standing on a horn of a bull, and how then earthquakes occur. Now this is concept that comes from Hindu mythology. So Intezar Hussain Saab basically mixes that mythology with Muslim notions of cosmology, and which ultimately tells us that there was this shared sense of culture and a shared sense of cosmology prevalent at least in Uttar Pradesh or the parts of India where Muslims and Hindus have lived together for thousands of centuries. Now that obviously,
Sir Anish, Sir
Gigi.
Anish, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the time limit has exceeded.
Okay, so let me just quickly wrap. So one is that the Zakir Hussain, Intezar Hussain makes a comment about the bifurcation of Hindu and Muslim culture into two, and he kind of argues that there was this complex culture, although this complex culture argument has been rebuted time and again by scholars committed to left ideology in India as well as in Pakistan. So the next thing that the reader comes to know is that Intezar Hussain Sahab makes a memory of the individual as authentic source of testimony in history. So in that sense, fiction ultimately, or this novel ultimately, broadens the scope of history, and it also serves as counterintuitive to the discourse of history driven by ideology of nationalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amish, for this wonderful talk. And I was just thinking about it when I read this novel. I did not, think about the name Zakir. The name Zakir, I think the word Zakir also it means a person who remembers.
Right, exactly.
So memory is central to this novel. So we'll talk about it later, inshallah, in the conversation, right?
This name of the protagonist has different theories about it, and a lot of critics have spoken about it. I can obviously talk about it in the question answer session.
All right. Okay, thank you. We will move now to the next presentation, which is by Aisha Ramzan from ComStats University, Islamabad, and its title is Vernacular Historiographical Reading of Primum's Punjabi Poetry 107 Kafiyan. Okay, so over to you, Aisha Ramzan.
And Salaam everyone. We've talked about in the previous sessions. I'm going to switch my camera because I do have some Wi-Fi disruption. Okay. So we've talked about Pakistani literature in this session, but my work is particularly based on vernacular Pakistani literature. And by vernacular, what I mean is indigenous or regional Pakistani literature. And I'm looking at this work, which is hardly known in Pakistan, by a 19th century female Punjabi poet. Somebody has their microphone on. Please kindly can you switch it off? Okay. So this work by the 19th century female Punjabi poet, Piru Preman, it's an instance of an astonishing accomplishment, one that can contribute to the ongoing debates on the female writings in the Punjabi genre of Kafi. And if we look at Kafi, and if it sort of resonates with you, it has been employed previously by the male Sufi poets as Shah Hussain, Bulle Shah, and Khwaja Ghulam Farid. But Piru Preman's Kafiyan, with the text title is called as 107 Kafiyan, as a vernacular genre, brings in a materiality of great complexity, one that incorporates the cultural, historical, and political vicissitudes of the pre-colonial India. And also because Piru's text and contribution to Punjabi poetry is completely disregarded in the literary history of South Asian writers, the analysis of her work and life vindicates how she's been a subject to the phenomena of social forgetting, something which is very close to what Amish Askari just now talked about in terms of the collective amnesia. So I talk about it in detail to argue that Piru's work is one of the muffled female voices, which has been consciously silenced in the national literary history of Pakistan. And now looking at the second slide, where I've titled Vernacular Historiography, I would argue for this approach to examine Piru's work, since it allows me to delineate on forgetting as a social phenomena which happens over a long period of time. And vernacular historiography offers sort of tools to reveal insight into a text, and it allows a wide range of sources beyond the mainstream scholarly articles and mainstream literature to be integrated in the study. And it allows for oral tradition of literature to be incorporated as part of the literary mainstream. To look into how this social forgetting, or what is meant by social forgetting, we need to remember that by social forgetting, we're positioning a kind of a phenomena of forgetting as a willful dismissal of certain popular, discomforting, and embarrassing legacies. And the embarrassing legacies are sort of embedded in Piru's work, which is Iksosat Kafiyan. And by looking at Iksosat Kafiyan, which is basically a micro-narrative of her life, what we come to know from a considerable short lifespan that she had, that Piru was brought up and she was born into a Muslim family. And in the scant accounts of her life, she is also referred to as a Kanjari, a Muslim prostitute, owing to her residence in the red light area of the pre-colonial Punjab. And, this autobiographical narrative in verse, it unveils the trajectory of Piru's life after she was rescued from an episode of kidnapping by her guru called Gulab Das. And she resided at Gulab Das Dera, and from where her life took a drastic turn. As this former prostitute from the low-caste Muslim family was accepted at the Dera of Gulab Das, she lived under the protection of her Guru Gulab Das in the Gulab Dasi community, which was commonly understood as a religious sect that belonged to a broader Sikh cultural heritage. And this began her intellectual life, where she authored the poetic composition Iksosat Kafiyan, and also a few other compositions that survive to this date. However, as we look at the micro-narrative, which the term that I've used in my slide 4, what we find is that Piru recollects her life at the Gulab Dasi Dera. And it becomes, in a way, Iksosat Kafiyan becomes a very telling historical document by a female author that discloses historical junctures, and it brings a lot of complexity to the historical accounts that we have of the pre-colonial era. Now, lying obliquely in Piru's account is the traumatic episode of her kidnapping, and also a reference to the forced sort of reversion to her, Muslim background. And Piru's recollection of her being forced to her Muslim identity allows the reader some discomforting truths about the past. For instance, what we know about the pre-colonial era is that it consisted of a considerable sort of peaceful and tolerant ethos. But however, what we find is inscribed within that narrative is a sort of a complexity of the coexistence of multiple forms of belief systems. But however, there was also a process whereby people were sort of confined in their social and religious they were confined to their social and religious positions. And as a multi-caste group, Gulab Dasi community, which is still, by the way, it's present in some part of Chakniawala, Kasur, it still continues to be labeled as socially radical and also mystical, but it allowed a lot of followers from other religions, and it allowed a number of castes in their community. And this inclusion of women in Gulab Dasi community is also one of the radical components of this small religious group, and something that Piru will sort of repeatedly voice in her work. So considering Piru's intellectual development and contribution in the Gulab Dasi community, we can also find her in a very close bondage with her guru, Gulab Das. And what we find is that Piru, in a lot of ways, inverts and subverts the societal norms. Her very participation in the intellectual and literary male-dominated sphere, it inverted the social arrangements, especially in pre-colonial societies when men and women had separate spheres through which they exerted their influence and power. But vernacular historiography asserts that these historical occurrences need to be looked over a longer period of time. And what we find is that, you know, all those inversions have now become subversions when read against the grain or read against the history of pre-colonial, of the present post-colonial Pakistan. Also imbibed within Piru's work is an intertwining of the Sufi and the Bhakti poets' sort of traits. And Piru Preman is the first female author of Punjabi Kafi, and she taps into the eclectic spirit of the Sufi poetry, and thus whereby she looks at and she eulogizes her guru. And what you find is that in Punjabi poetry or Punjabi devotional text, there's always this relationship towards the guru or the peer or the mentor. Formerly, Shah Hussein's devotion to Madhulal Hussain or Bulle Shah's adoration with Inayat Hussain, they've been interpreted as the true mystical relationship. But however, her identification, Piru's identification with her mentor, though is an appropriation of the Sufi master-disciple relationship, but it is more complicated than that. Piru Preman calls Gulab Das as the guru. However, at times she also conjures him as a lover, using words with more erotic overtones as Sanya, Balam, Pia. Now, a woman author as Piru, who comes from a subordinate class, she brings in a discourse of politicization of eros. And this is the erotic dimension, which is bodily, psychologically, and sort of culturally problematic to the present ongoing ethos in both India and Pakistan. And the way she unapologetically remembers her past as a prostitute is also one of the discomforting aspects of her work. The present state of Piru's legacy thus remains shrouded in silence, so much so that the small number of Gulab Das community that resides in Pakistan, they present Piru as the mother figure. And the capital gains from this is that she's represented as a desexualized figure, and which highlights the present society's overbearing concerns about preserving, the moral fabric, and thus furnishing stronger representations of domesticated women. So what I've argued is that how Piru's work is illustrative of a willing forgetfulness on the part of this religious community and on the part of our literary historiography as well. Modern Pakistan sort of echoes this, stringent rupture with the traditional regional literature, and which is, and the implication of looking at Piru's work would be to find interesting heterogeneity of this experiences, which have posed threats to established orders and systems in the post-colonial nations of India and Pakistan both. And also, there's this idea of retrieving this text so that we can look into the history of the writing of Kafi, and we can revise it in the context of the presence of a female author too. So if you have any questions, you can ask in the end. This was just a very preliminary sort of work. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. Very interesting talk, and these this inclusion of female Sufi voice, and it broadens the dimension of what we call Pakistani literature. So there are so many different voices which have gone unnoticed and unacknowledged. So it's wonderful that people are, covering them, and people are talking about them, and recognizing them, helping us actually recognize them. All right, so we will move to the next and the final presentation in today's session. This is Jealousy, Betrayal, and Alienation in Ahmad Smoke, and the presenter is Sadia Nazir from Shahid Benazir Bhutto Women University, Peshawar. So, Sadia, if you are with us, please take over. Samavia, is Sadia there among the attendees?
So no, she is not in the attendee list.
All right. So do we then proceed to the question answer session then?
Then I guess yes, we should proceed to the question.
Okay. So all right. So a wonderful session, very intellectually vigorous and rigorous. Delighted to hear all these, researchers and who are talking about Pakistani literature from so many different angles. Now, just a couple of things which I have noted down. First is when I saw the title of the session is Pakistani literature. So I, sort of putting a question mark beside it. Pakistani literature, what is Pakistani literature? So, the answer given by all these presenters is that if there is so much diversity, there is a very inclusive, definition of Pakistani literature that we get from today's session. So we have Anglophone literature, Pakistani Anglophone literature, we have Punjabi Sufi literature, and we have Urdu literature from Pakistan, and there are so many other languages and writers which obviously not any conference can cover, any single conference can cover. So there is so much diversity in Pakistan and so much diversity in its literature that has to be acknowledged, it has to be appreciated. So this is what our session allowed us to do, to appreciate all this diversity. Now, the question that comes to my mind is, from listening to these talks, is that diversity, fine, that there are so many different communities and ethnicities who live in Pakistan and in the diaspora, but do we have a coherent national narrative as well? It is a very contested narrative, so especially in literature, do we have a national narrative as well? And by national narrative, I mean that all these, voices coming from different regions, different localities, different spaces, from different experiences, do they then unite and create a composite sort of picture? So I was exploring this idea, okay, which work we would call the great Pakistani novel. And why a novel? Why not some other form of literature? It's because the novel is a very open form, and you can, include any other form of literature within the scope of a novel. So maybe the great Pakistani novel remains to be written. There was this survey carried out by Dawn once, and many published writers were asked which novel do they consider to be the great Pakistani novel. And one interesting response was by Musharraf Farooqi, the writer of a published writer, Musharraf Ali Farooqi. So his response was that the great Pakistani novel is actually Kai Chand The Sare Asma, which is a novel by Shamsur Rahman Farooqi from India. So a great Pakistani novel was written in India, so which again, tells us the inclusiveness of Pakistan. Another thing I noted was that we consider literature to be a space where we can invite and welcome the marginalized, the neglected, the people who have not been acknowledged. So this is a consistent and persistent theme throughout the session. And a variety of dimensions Pakistani literature was viewed from. We had history, we had philosophy, we had Sufism, we had politics. So all these things, all these perspectives were brought on Pakistani Anglophone writing, Pakistani literature, not just Anglophone writing, but Pakistani literature in general. All right, so if anyone has any questions, so according to the guidelines, you can type your question, you can post your question in the chat, and then the presenters will respond.
Dr. Faisal, I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank you for chairing the session. It's wonderful to see you, and I'm so glad that you have been able to chair this session.
It's an honor for me, ma'am, actually, to be given this opportunity, of course. And I would have loved to travel to Lahore to be there actually to meet you all as I used to do. But these days, traveling is so difficult. There are so many problems. So here I am online.
I can see lots of my students who are now teachers, and I'm very, very proud of them in the various institutions they're teaching and the various forums that they are representing on internationally. So I'm pretty proud of all of you, the participants of this session. Thank you, Dr. Faisal. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Okay, so if we do not have any questions, so we can just conclude our session. Thank you all. Thank you, the presenters. I had a few things. If we have time, I can ask a couple of questions from the presenters. So when I was listening to Amna's presentation, the early work of these pioneers of Anglophone fiction in Pakistan, they were influenced by politics. But what about the later works? Do you have any idea what they have been doing since that time? 1960s, 1980s, but now we are in the 21st century. So what have these people been writing? What are the new contexts?
Thank you for your question. I think this is a great question. The later works in Pakistani Anglophone fiction, I think post 9/11 at least, they have been dominated by a series of homogeneous themes, especially related to the refugee crisis, terrorism, which I think reflects a more cosmopolitan understanding of fiction writing. And we can still see some of the themes from these earlier texts that are present in the later works, but I think the thematic has changed largely, and so has the stylistic features of these contemporary texts. So I think it would also be a good area of study to compare the earlier texts of Pakistani Anglophone fiction with the later texts that are present today in the mainstream environment, and see if there are any similarities or differences that can be made.
Okay. Uh, yeah, and you see, Jamar Boss lives in America, I think, and Bubsy Silva also lives in America.
Yeah,
And
that's
Jamar
correct.
Boss has been writing about his, experiences of living in different parts of the world.
And I think
Um,
diasporic fiction has largely dominated the scene of Pakistani Anglophone contemporary writing. So that
right.
also plays a role.
Okay. Shadi, I have also a question for Tehreem. If Tehreem is with us, can I ask you this question, Tehreem?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now you talked about this border crossings and all.
Yeah.
So a kind of cosmopolitan, outlook is noticeable in such ideas of the border crossing. That we develop this sort of planetary consciousness at all, and all related stuff. But when I read about cosmopolitanism, for example, I am referring to a book by Kwame Anthony Appiah, Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers. So he has a chapter in that book, which is titled Counter Cosmopolitans. Counter Cosmopolitans. So, and he says, he describes the Muslims as, counter cosmopolitans. That, he doesn't say an alternative cosmopolitan. So even if we are thinking about borderless world, so what kind of, uh, culture such a borderless world would have? Is it really that open? These borders that we talk about, practically, isn't it that some vision or version of a cosmopolitan world is excluded from such, series and analyses? In other words,
Sorry.
how do you accommodate religious identities in such border crossing experiences?
As far as the paper is concerned, I had talked about different kinds of borders. Borders can be political borders, they can be linguistic borders, they can be technological borders. So it depends on the kinds of borders that we're talking about. And borders are a political necessity, so they cannot be, done away with. But in terms of I'm not contending for a borderless world. All I am trying to do is that I'm trying to propagate a message that that borders need to be flexible, and there has to be a sense of empathy, because as far as the Mexican borders are concerned, they have been a traumatic experience for children. So if you talk about borders and children in particular, it is a very traumatizing experience that they are severed from their parents, and they are not dealt with properly. So that is how I perceive this border dilemma. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, but I think that we need to also think about this, how we can accommodate religious identities into these, mixings and cross fertilizations and all, such ideas that we are thinking about. Okay, one question is for. Let me just Namra and Kirat. I'm sorry, nobody is asking a question, so I thought there were the things that I was taking note of, so I should just, we have 5 minutes to the end of the session, so I can just ask this question. So Namra is with us.
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Namra and Kirat. So this idea of abrogation and appropriation, the Empire Writes Back. I'm forgetting the name of the writer, Gareth Griffiths, Tiffin, and the main author I'm forgetting the name of. So, this idea of
Bill Ashcroft.
Yeah. So, maybe memory to post memory, wherever that name went, I don't know. So, this idea of deconstructing language structures in order to, convey a different sort of experience. A colleague of mine has given a very interesting expression. Okay, this is a subversion. Is this a subversion of the colonial discourse, or a sub-version of colonial discourse? The kind of postmodernist and deconstructionist thinking that is going on in the West. So this whole idea of appropriation and abrogation is the, newest fad over there. So is it really, effective as, as a tool of bringing out the voice of the suppressed or oppressed? Or is it just wordplay, linguistic wordplay?
Personally, I think it's not subversion, it's reclamation. We are reclaiming something that exists within us. It is something that is, this language is inherent within us, and now we're colonizing the language just like it was colonized for us. For example, if we see Urdu language, it didn't originate inherently. It was abrogated and appropriated through Arabic or Persian, and even in Mughal times, Urdu became a language through different dialects. Similarly, I think in today's Pakistani literature, English is something that is being abrogated and appropriated for own personalized and domesticated versions. So we cannot really say that we're the suppressed here, because as we appropriate and abrogate, we're owning something that we do have, and we have an ownership within it. And we're reducing this gap of otherization that existed before.
Thank you. Aisha Ramzan, just one thought came up in my mind.
Yes.
This, you mentioned that there is this, a discussion or a representation of those things which we generally exclude and suppress and try to forget from, our consciousness. Now in Sufi poetry and generally in in many Sufi poetry, kufriya kalmat jisko hum kehte hain, and a sort of acceptance of kufr, an acknowledgement of that. So isn't it a common trait in Sufi poetry? I remember wo Bulle Shah, I think, okay, चल बोले जा सारे अन्य कुछ कोई काफिर कह रहा तू आहो आहो आ So something like that. I don't remember it exactly, but this is something quite common.
Yeah. What we see is that Nehru extends that tradition where, you know, she, by reinforcing the same political themes and this, you know, her preoccupation of critiquing on caste and religion, we do see its visible presence in the work of Shah Hussain and Bulle Shah. But however, we also find that, you know, when I read Exosat Kafi, that Piru's intervention into the tradition is forthright, and her writings reveal a reflection of, societal codes, religious norms, and also uh, they sort of navigate in the gendered aspects, the problem of the gender as well. So, in a lot of ways, she's been more explicit. There's a lot of, you know, this anger and rage, whereby she mocks so many religious identities. For and it says they make false religions, false promises. Snipping the mustache, they call themselves birds. Hindus are made by wearing the sacred thread and keeping the top knot. Women can't be like us. They are both wrong. So there are a number of religious identities that she sort of criticizes very, very vehemently.
Thank you. I think the time for our session is up. So thank you all for joining this session, for presenting your views, and listening to all the presenters. And Samavia, thank you for coordinating the whole thing. It was done very well. So I hope this conference goes on, and there are so many other interesting sessions coming up. So we are all excited to join other sessions as well. Ji Samavia.
Thank you so
Ending
much.
the meeting.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay.
Thank you so much all for joining the session. Have a nice day. Allah Hafiz.